Most people believe peace comes from controlling the world around them. Controlling circumstances. Controlling outcomes. Controlling how others behave. But this belief quietly creates the opposite result. Because the more someone tries to control everything outside themselves, the more fragile their peace becomes. One unexpected comment can ruin their mood. One disagreement can stay in their mind for hours. One moment of rejection can create days of emotional tension. And slowly, their emotional state becomes dependent on things they cannot control. But there is another way of living. A way that many psychologically strong individuals eventually discover. It is called emotional detachment. At first, the phrase sounds cold. It sounds like indifference. It sounds like not caring. But true emotional detachment is not about becoming distant from life. It is about becoming free from unnecessary emotional chaos. It means you still care. You still feel. You still connect with people. But your inner peace is no longer controlled by every external event. And once someone begins understanding this mindset, something remarkable happens. They stop reacting to everything. And they begin choosing their responses. Because most emotional suffering does not come from the event itself. It comes from the reaction to the event. Imagine two people experiencing the same criticism. One person becomes angry. They replay the words repeatedly. They feel attacked. Their mood collapses. But the other person pauses. They observe the situation calmly. They ask themselves whether the criticism contains useful insight. If it does, they learn from it. If it does not, they release it. The same event. Two completely different emotional experiences. And the difference is not the situation. The difference is psychological distance. Psychological distance is the foundation of emotional detachment. It is the ability to step back mentally and observe your emotions rather than being controlled by them. Most people live inside their emotions. When anger appears, they become anger. When frustration appears, they become frustration. But emotionally detached individuals experience something different. They feel the emotion. But they also observe it. Almost like watching a wave pass through their mind. And this observation creates space. Space between the emotion and the reaction. And inside that space lies choice. Choice to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. But developing this ability requires awareness. Because the human brain is designed to react quickly. For thousands of years, fast emotional reactions helped humans survive. Fear triggered escape. Anger triggered defense. But modern life rarely requires such immediate emotional reactions. Most conflicts are psychological, not physical. Most threats are social, not life-threatening. Yet the brain still responds with intensity. A small disagreement can trigger stress. A harsh comment can trigger anxiety. But emotional detachment retrains the mind. It teaches the brain that not every stimulus requires a strong reaction. And this training changes how you experience the world. Instead of constantly riding emotional highs and lows, your mind becomes steadier. But there is another important misconception about emotional detachment. Many people think detachment means avoiding relationships. Avoiding connection. Avoiding vulnerability. But real emotional detachment actually improves relationships. Because when you are emotionally stable, you respond more calmly. You listen more clearly. You react less impulsively. And this calm presence creates healthier interactions. Think about conversations during conflict. Two people reacting emotionally often escalate the situation. Anger meets anger. Defensiveness meets defensiveness. And the conversation becomes a battle rather than a dialogue. But when one person remains emotionally detached, the dynamic changes. They listen. They pause. They respond thoughtfully. And often, the emotional intensity of the situation decreases. Because calmness influences the environment. But emotional detachment also protects something incredibly valuable. Mental peace. Peace is fragile when your emotions are controlled by external events. But peace becomes stable when your mindset becomes intentional. Intentional about what deserves emotional investment. Not every problem deserves your energy. Not every comment deserves your attention. Not every disagreement deserves your stress. Mentally strong individuals learn to choose their battles carefully. They conserve emotional energy for things that truly matter. Growth. Purpose. Meaningful relationships. And this selective attention creates a quieter mind. A mind that is not constantly disturbed by every small event. But something even deeper begins happening when emotional detachment becomes a habit. You start seeing situations more clearly. Without emotional distortion. Without exaggerated interpretation. Without unnecessary drama. For example, someone might ignore your message. An emotionally reactive mind might assume rejection. Or disrespect. But an emotionally detached mind simply observes the fact. A message was not answered. And nothing more. Because interpretation creates emotion. And interpretation is often inaccurate. Most people interpret situations through assumptions rather than evidence. But emotional detachment reduces this habit. It encourages observation before conclusion. And observation creates clarity. But clarity also creates patience. When your mind is calm, you do not rush to react. You allow situations to unfold naturally. You allow people to reveal their intentions over time. And patience often reveals truth that emotional reactions would have missed. But the real power of emotional detachment appears in difficult moments. Moments of conflict. Moments of rejection. Moments of uncertainty. Because in those moments, most people lose control of their emotional state. But someone who has trained their mind to step back remains grounded. Not cold. Not indifferent. Simply steady. And steadiness is powerful. Because a steady mind can think clearly even during emotional storms. A steady mind can make better decisions. A steady mind can protect peace while the world around it becomes chaotic. But this mindset does not develop overnight. It grows slowly. Through awareness. Through reflection. Through repeated practice. Each time you pause instead of reacting, emotional strength grows. Each time you observe an emotion rather than becoming it, psychological distance increases. And gradually, your mind becomes calmer. Stronger. More resilient. But the most interesting part of emotional detachment is what happens after the chaos fades. Because once you stop reacting to everything, you begin noticing something profound. Life becomes quieter. Not externally, but internally. And in that quiet space, something valuable begins to appear. Real peace. The kind of peace that does not depend on perfect circumstances. The kind of peace that exists even when life becomes unpredictable. And that peace becomes the foundation for something far more powerful than emotional reaction. A mind that is truly in control. There is a quiet misunderstanding that keeps many people trapped in emotional exhaustion. They believe that caring deeply about everything makes them strong. They believe reacting strongly proves their passion. They believe holding on to every emotional experience shows loyalty or sincerity. But in reality, this constant emotional engagement often creates the opposite result. It creates burnout. Because the human mind was never designed to carry every emotional burden it encounters. Yet many people try to do exactly that. They carry arguments long after they are finished. They carry criticism long after it was spoken. They carry disappointment long after the moment has passed. And slowly, these emotional weights accumulate. But emotional detachment introduces a different approach. It teaches the mind that not everything deserves to be carried forward. Some experiences should simply pass through. Just like weather. A storm may appear. Rain may fall. But eventually the sky clears again. The storm does not need to stay. And emotions function the same way. Anger appears. Frustration appears. Sadness appears. But none of these emotions are permanent unless the mind continues feeding them. And this is where emotional detachment becomes powerful. It interrupts the cycle of emotional replay. Most people experience an event once. But then they relive it repeatedly in their thoughts. They replay the conversation. They imagine alternative responses. They wonder what someone meant. And this mental replay extends the emotional experience far beyond the original moment. But emotionally detached individuals notice this pattern. And once they notice it, they begin choosing not to participate. They allow the emotion to appear. But they do not continue feeding it through constant rumination. This creates psychological distance. Distance between the event and the identity. Because one of the biggest emotional mistakes people make is identifying with temporary emotions. Someone feels angry and concludes they are angry. Someone feels rejected and concludes they are unwanted. Someone feels anxious and concludes something must be wrong. But emotions are temporary states. Not permanent identities. And emotional detachment allows you to observe emotions without becoming them. This small shift changes everything. Because when emotions are observed rather than absorbed, they lose much of their intensity. But something else begins happening at the same time. Your perspective expands. When emotions dominate the mind, perspective becomes narrow. A small disagreement can feel enormous. A minor problem can feel catastrophic. But when emotional distance appears, perspective widens. You begin seeing situations within a larger context. You realize that most conflicts are temporary. Most disappointments are manageable. Most setbacks are learning experiences rather than disasters. And this broader perspective creates emotional resilience. Resilience means recovering quickly from difficult experiences. It does not mean avoiding emotion entirely. It means experiencing emotion without becoming trapped inside it. But resilience also requires an important mental skill. Letting go. Letting go is one of the most misunderstood psychological abilities. Many people believe letting go means weakness. They believe holding on proves strength. But holding on to emotional pain often prevents growth. Imagine carrying a heavy object every day. At first it may feel manageable. But over time it becomes exhausting. The same thing happens with emotional burdens. The longer they are carried, the heavier they feel. But emotional detachment teaches something different. It teaches that releasing unnecessary weight creates freedom. Freedom to move forward. freedom to focus on what truly matters. But letting go does not mean pretending something never happened. It simply means refusing to let the past control the present. Because when the mind constantly revisits past conflicts, it cannot fully engage with the present moment. And the present moment is where life actually happens. But emotional detachment also changes how you interpret other people's behavior. Many emotional reactions come from interpretation rather than reality. Someone may appear distant, and the mind immediately assumes rejection. Someone may disagree, and the mind assumes hostility. But interpretation often creates unnecessary emotional responses. Because interpretation is based on assumptions rather than facts. Emotionally detached individuals slow this process down. Instead of immediately assuming the worst, they observe the situation calmly. They allow time for clarity to emerge. And time often reveals that many emotional reactions were unnecessary. But this calm observation also protects relationships. Because impulsive emotional reactions often damage connections. Words spoken in anger. Decisions made in frustration. Actions driven by insecurity. These reactions create consequences that last longer than the original emotion. But emotional detachment creates space for thoughtful response. And thoughtful responses strengthen relationships rather than weaken them. But perhaps the most powerful effect of emotional detachment is the return of mental peace. Peace does not come from controlling every situation. Peace comes from controlling your internal reaction to situations. Because life will always include uncertainty. Unexpected events. Unexpected disagreements. Unexpected disappointments. Trying to eliminate all of these experiences is impossible. But learning to remain calm during them is possible. And that ability transforms your experience of life. Because emotional storms may still appear. But they no longer destroy your stability. They pass. Just like weather. And eventually, calm returns. But the most interesting part of emotional detachment is what happens when the mind becomes truly quiet. You begin noticing things you once overlooked. The subtle beauty of ordinary moments. The clarity of focused thought. The calm satisfaction of simply being present. Because emotional chaos often distracts the mind from appreciating the present. But when emotional noise fades, awareness becomes sharper. You notice your surroundings more clearly. You listen more attentively. You respond more thoughtfully. And this awareness creates a deeper connection with life itself. Not a connection based on intense emotional reactions. But a connection based on calm presence. And calm presence is one of the rarest qualities in modern life. Because most people live in constant emotional stimulation. Constant information. Constant reaction. But emotional detachment introduces balance. Balance between feeling and observing. Between caring and releasing. Between engagement and peace. And this balance creates something incredibly valuable. Inner stability. A stability that remains steady even when the world becomes unpredictable. But the journey toward emotional detachment is only beginning. Because once someone learns to observe their emotions, a much deeper transformation begins to unfold inside the mind. There is a deeper layer to emotional detachment that many people do not notice at first. It begins with a simple but powerful realization. Not every emotional reaction is truly yours. Many of the emotions people feel every day are borrowed from the environment around them. From conversations. From social expectations. From the emotional states of others. Human beings are naturally empathetic creatures. We absorb emotional signals constantly. When someone around us becomes angry, tension spreads. When someone becomes anxious, uncertainty spreads. When someone becomes negative, pessimism spreads. And without awareness, people begin carrying emotions that were never originally theirs. But emotional detachment introduces a different kind of awareness. It teaches the mind to recognize the difference between feeling empathy and absorbing emotional energy. Empathy means understanding what someone else is feeling. Absorbing emotional energy means allowing those feelings to take control of your own emotional state. And there is a critical difference between the two. Emotionally detached individuals remain compassionate. They can understand another person's frustration. They can recognize someone's sadness. But they do not allow those emotions to dominate their own internal balance. Because once emotional balance disappears, clarity disappears with it. And clarity is essential for responding wisely. Imagine someone speaking to you in anger. Most people instinctively mirror that anger. Their voice becomes louder. Their body becomes tense. Their thoughts become reactive. But emotionally detached individuals approach the situation differently. They observe the emotion. But they do not mirror it. They remain calm. And that calmness changes the dynamic of the entire interaction. Because emotions often spread through imitation. When one person escalates, others escalate. But when one person remains steady, the emotional intensity of the situation often decreases. This ability is sometimes called emotional regulation. But emotional detachment goes even deeper. It is not only about controlling reactions. It is about redefining what deserves emotional investment. Many people invest emotional energy in things that do not truly matter. Online arguments. Minor inconveniences. Temporary frustrations. And over time, these small emotional reactions accumulate into chronic stress. But mentally strong individuals learn to evaluate emotional investment carefully. They ask themselves a simple question. Will this matter tomorrow? Or next week? Or next year? And surprisingly often, the answer is no. Most emotional disturbances are temporary. They appear suddenly and disappear quickly. But the mind extends them through rumination. Through repeated thinking. Through unnecessary interpretation. And emotional detachment interrupts this cycle. It reminds the mind that not every moment requires emotional intensity. Because emotional intensity is a limited resource. When it is spent constantly, exhaustion follows. But when it is conserved, it becomes powerful. Emotionally detached individuals reserve emotional energy for what truly matters. Meaningful relationships. Personal growth. Important decisions. Purposeful action. And this selective investment creates a calmer mental environment. But something even deeper begins happening when emotional detachment becomes habitual. You begin noticing the difference between reacting and responding. Reaction is automatic. It happens instantly. Often driven by emotion rather than reflection. Response is intentional. It includes observation, understanding, choice. And this difference changes everything. Because reactions often create consequences that cannot be undone. Words spoken in anger. Decisions made in frustration. Actions taken in fear. But responses are thoughtful. Measured. Aligned with long-term values rather than temporary emotion. But developing this ability requires awareness of one important truth. Emotions are powerful signals, but they are not always accurate guides. Fear can appear even when no real threat exists. Anger can appear even when misunderstanding is the true cause. Sadness can appear even when a situation simply requires patience. And emotional detachment allows you to recognize these signals without immediately obeying them. You feel the emotion. You observe it. But you also examine it. And sometimes the most powerful decision is to wait before acting. Because emotions often change quickly. What feels overwhelming in one moment may feel manageable later. But if you act immediately, you remove the opportunity for perspective. And perspective is essential for wisdom. But emotional detachment also changes how you experience disappointment. Disappointment is inevitable in life. Plans fail. People change. Expectations are not always met. But emotionally reactive individuals interpret disappointment as personal loss. They attach their identity to outcomes. If something fails, they feel they have failed. But emotionally detached individuals approach disappointment differently. They see it as information. A signal that something needs adjustment. A moment that invites reflection. And reflection creates learning. Learning creates growth. But growth only happens when disappointment does not become emotional paralysis. And emotional detachment protects against that paralysis. It allows you to acknowledge disappointment without losing momentum. But perhaps the most powerful effect of emotional detachment is the protection of inner peace. Peace is not the absence of problems. Life will always include challenges. Unexpected events. Moments of uncertainty. But peace becomes possible when your internal state remains stable regardless of external conditions. This stability creates resilience. Resilience allows you to face challenges without collapsing emotionally. It allows you to adapt without losing clarity. It allows you to continue moving forward even when circumstances become difficult. And resilience grows stronger each time you practice emotional distance. Each time you observe an emotion without being consumed by it. Each time you choose calmness over reaction. Each time you allow a difficult moment to pass without attaching unnecessary meaning to it. Gradually, your mind becomes steadier. Your reactions become slower. Your responses become wiser. But the real transformation of emotional detachment has not fully appeared yet. Because once someone learns to regulate their emotions, they begin discovering something even more powerful. The ability to protect their peace regardless of what happens around them. There is a moment in the journey of emotional detachment when a person begins realizing something quietly profound. Peace is not created by controlling life. Peace is created by controlling your relationship with life. Most people spend years trying to fix the outside world. Trying to control outcomes. Trying to control how people behave. Trying to control how situations unfold. But the outside world has too many variables. People change. Plans fail. Unexpected events appear. And when peace depends on controlling all of these factors, it becomes fragile. One small disruption can destroy emotional balance. But emotional detachment introduces a different philosophy. Instead of controlling everything around you, you strengthen the stability within you. You become less dependent on circumstances. Less dependent on outcomes. Less dependent on the reactions of others. And once this internal stability appears, something interesting begins happening. Situations that once felt overwhelming begin feeling manageable. Because the external event is no longer determining the intensity of your emotional state. Your mindset is. But this shift requires understanding a powerful psychological principle. Attachment creates suffering. Attachment means believing that your happiness depends on a specific outcome, a specific person, a specific expectation. And when reality does not match that expectation, emotional pain appears. But emotional detachment does not mean avoiding life. It means releasing rigid expectations about how life must unfold. Because expectations often create emotional pressure. When someone expects constant appreciation, criticism becomes unbearable. When someone expects perfect outcomes, mistakes become devastating. But when expectations soften, perspective expands. You begin understanding that life includes uncertainty. And uncertainty does not have to destroy peace. In fact, uncertainty can create freedom. Because when you stop expecting life to behave perfectly, you stop being shocked when it doesn't. You become adaptable. Adaptability is one of the strongest forms of psychological strength. It allows you to adjust quickly. To learn from situations rather than resisting them emotionally. And adaptability grows when attachment decreases. But there is another important realization that appears during this stage. Many emotional conflicts come from trying to control other people. Trying to control their opinions. Trying to control their behavior. Trying to control how they treat you. But people are unpredictable. They have their own beliefs. Their own emotions. Their own motivations. And emotional suffering often begins when someone tries to force another person to behave differently. But emotional detachment introduces acceptance. Acceptance does not mean approval. It simply means recognizing reality without fighting it emotionally. Someone may disagree with you. Someone may misunderstand you. Someone may choose a different path. And emotional detachment allows you to observe these realities without immediately experiencing emotional collapse. Because the mind stops interpreting every difference as a personal threat. Instead, differences become natural aspects of human interaction. But this mindset also protects something incredibly valuable. Your energy. Emotional energy is limited. And when it is spent on things you cannot control, exhaustion follows. Arguing endlessly. Overthinking someone's behavior. Trying to change people who do not want to change. All of these actions drain emotional energy. But emotionally detached individuals become selective. They invest energy where it can create meaningful results. Personal growth. Constructive relationships. Creative work. Purposeful action. And by redirecting energy toward meaningful areas, life becomes more fulfilling. But something else begins happening as well. Your reactions become slower. Not slower because you are passive. But slower because you are thoughtful. Thoughtfulness introduces reflection. Instead of reacting instantly, you begin asking questions internally. Is this worth my energy? Is this situation temporary? Will this matter in the long term? These questions create emotional distance. And emotional distance allows wisdom to emerge. Because wisdom rarely appears during emotional intensity. It appears during calm observation. But calm observation also creates another powerful ability. The ability to let things go. Letting go is one of the most important psychological skills a person can develop. Not every misunderstanding needs correction. Not every criticism needs defense. Not every conflict needs resolution. Sometimes the healthiest response is simply to move forward. Because time resolves many situations naturally. But emotional attachment often prevents this. The mind continues replaying the event. Trying to find the perfect response. trying to prove something. But emotional detachment breaks this cycle. It allows the mind to release unfinished emotional tension. And releasing tension restores peace. But perhaps the most interesting part of emotional detachment is how it changes perception. You begin seeing patterns in human behavior more clearly. You notice how often people react emotionally to situations that are temporary. You notice how often people interpret events personally when they are not personal. And this awareness creates compassion. Because once you recognize how emotional reactions influence behavior, you begin understanding others more deeply. You see their reactions not as attacks, but as expressions of their internal struggles. And this perspective softens emotional conflict. Because understanding replaces judgment. But emotional detachment also protects you from becoming trapped in someone else's emotional storm. Someone may be angry. Someone may be frustrated. Someone may be overwhelmed. But you do not need to mirror their emotional state. You can remain calm, present, grounded. And this calmness often influences the environment around you. Because emotional states spread through interaction. Calmness invites calmness. But reacting emotionally often spreads chaos. And over time, emotionally detached individuals develop a powerful reputation. People begin noticing their steadiness, their composure, their ability to remain balanced during difficult situations. And this presence commands respect. Not through force, but through stability. But the deepest transformation of emotional detachment is still unfolding. Because once someone stops being controlled by emotional reactions, they begin discovering something far more valuable. The ability to protect their peace no matter what the world around them becomes. There is a quiet strength that begins to appear when emotional detachment becomes part of your thinking. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. Most people may not even notice it at first. But internally, everything begins changing. Because the mind is no longer constantly pulled in different emotional directions. And this stability creates a new kind of awareness. You begin noticing how much emotional noise exists in everyday life. Small conflicts. Endless opinions. Unnecessary arguments. Social expectations. And most of these emotional disturbances have something in common. They are temporary. Yet people often treat them as if they are permanent crises. One disagreement becomes hours of frustration. One negative comment becomes days of overthinking. But emotional detachment introduces a different perspective. Not every emotional trigger deserves your attention. Because attention is a powerful resource. Whatever receives your attention grows stronger in your mind. When you replay criticism repeatedly, the criticism grows. When you replay frustration repeatedly, the frustration grows. But when attention is withdrawn, emotional intensity begins fading. This is one of the most important psychological skills a person can develop. The ability to withdraw attention from unnecessary emotional triggers. But this ability requires awareness of something most people overlook. The mind constantly searches for stimulation. It looks for problems to solve. Conflicts to analyze. Stories to interpret. And when the mind becomes bored or restless, it often creates emotional drama just to feel engaged. This is why small issues sometimes feel larger than they truly are. Because the mind exaggerates them. But emotional detachment reduces this exaggeration. It teaches the mind to observe events without immediately assigning dramatic meaning to them. Because meaning is often created by interpretation rather than reality. Someone may speak briefly. The mind interprets rudeness. Someone may seem distant. The mind interprets rejection. Someone may disagree. The mind interprets disrespect. But emotional detachment slows this interpretation process. Instead of immediately assuming negative meaning, you observe calmly. You allow more information to appear. And often, the situation becomes clearer with time. Because many emotional misunderstandings come from incomplete information. But emotional detachment also protects something deeper. Your sense of self. Many people unconsciously allow other people's opinions to define their identity. Praise raises their confidence. Criticism destroys it. Approval creates happiness. Disapproval creates insecurity. And this emotional dependence gives enormous power to the outside world. Because if your self-worth depends on the opinions of others, your peace becomes fragile. But emotional detachment reclaims that power. It reminds you that opinions are simply perspectives. Not absolute truths. People interpret the world through their own experiences. Their own beliefs. Their own emotional states. And their opinions often reflect those internal conditions rather than objective reality. Once this becomes clear, criticism loses much of its emotional impact. Because criticism becomes information rather than identity. If the criticism is useful, you learn from it. If it is inaccurate, you release it. But you do not allow it to define you. And this mental independence creates confidence. Not loud confidence. Not performative confidence. But quiet internal confidence. The kind that does not need constant validation. Because it is built on self-understanding rather than external approval. But something even more interesting begins happening when emotional detachment grows stronger. You stop trying to prove yourself to everyone. Many people spend enormous emotional energy trying to control how they are perceived. Trying to appear impressive. Trying to gain approval. Trying to avoid criticism. But this constant performance becomes exhausting. Because no one can control every perception. Different people will always have different opinions. And emotional detachment releases the need for universal approval. It allows you to live authentically rather than performatively. To express your thoughts honestly. To make decisions aligned with your values. And to accept that not everyone will agree. This acceptance removes enormous psychological pressure. Because the goal shifts from pleasing everyone to being consistent with your principles. But emotional detachment also improves focus. When the mind is not constantly distracted by emotional drama, it becomes clearer. Calmer. More capable of deep thought. You begin focusing on meaningful goals rather than reacting to every distraction. You become more productive. More intentional. More purposeful. Because your attention is no longer fragmented by emotional noise. But the greatest benefit of emotional detachment may be something even simpler. Peace. Real peace. Not temporary calmness that disappears when something goes wrong. But steady peace that remains present even when life becomes unpredictable. Because you understand something important. You cannot control everything that happens. But you can control how you respond. And that response determines the quality of your experience. Two people can experience the same situation and feel completely different emotions. One reacts with frustration. The other responds with curiosity. One becomes overwhelmed. The other becomes reflective. The situation is the same. But the interpretation changes everything. And emotional detachment gives you control over that interpretation. But there is another subtle transformation happening beneath the surface. You begin trusting your mind more. Because when emotional reactions no longer dominate your thinking, clarity increases. You become better at evaluating situations objectively. You see patterns more easily. You make decisions more thoughtfully. And this clarity creates confidence in your judgment. But this confidence is different from arrogance. It does not assume you are always right. Instead, it trusts your ability to observe, reflect, and adjust. And this flexible confidence allows you to navigate complex situations without becoming emotionally overwhelmed. But the journey into emotional detachment is far from finished. Because once someone begins experiencing this level of inner calm, they start discovering an even deeper psychological freedom. The freedom that appears when you no longer allow the emotional chaos of the world to disturb your inner balance. At a certain point in the journey of emotional detachment, a person begins to notice something unexpected. Life becomes quieter. Not quieter externally. The world is still busy. People still argue. Opinions still collide. Unexpected situations still appear. But internally, the noise begins to fade. Because emotional detachment slowly removes one of the biggest sources of mental chaos. Unnecessary reaction. Most people live in a constant state of reaction. Someone says something. They react. Someone disagrees. They react. Something goes wrong. They react. And this endless cycle creates emotional fatigue. Because reacting requires energy. Every reaction consumes attention. Every reaction consumes mental space. But emotional detachment introduces a pause. A moment between stimulus and response. And inside that pause lies a powerful question. Does this deserve my energy? It seems like a simple question. But it changes everything. Because once the mind begins asking this question consistently, emotional reactions start becoming selective. Not everything deserves engagement. Not every disagreement deserves defense. Not every criticism deserves explanation. Sometimes the most powerful response is silence. But silence is difficult for many people. Silence feels like surrender. Silence feels like weakness. Yet emotionally detached individuals understand something deeper. Silence is often strength. Because silence protects peace. Imagine someone trying to provoke you. They want a reaction. They want emotional engagement. But when no reaction appears, the emotional chain breaks. The situation loses its intensity. Because emotional conflict requires participation from both sides. But emotional detachment refuses unnecessary participation. And this refusal creates calmness. But calmness also reveals something important about human behavior. Many emotional conflicts are not about the surface issue. They are about validation. People want their feelings acknowledged. Their opinions recognized. Their identity respected. And when they do not feel heard, their emotional intensity increases. But emotionally detached individuals can recognize this dynamic. Instead of reacting defensively, they observe calmly. They listen carefully. And sometimes simply acknowledging another person's perspective reduces the entire conflict. Because emotional intensity often comes from feeling misunderstood. But emotional detachment also changes how you experience uncertainty. Uncertainty is one of the biggest sources of anxiety in modern life. People want predictable outcomes. Clear answers. Guaranteed results. But life rarely provides these. Plans change. Opportunities appear unexpectedly. Challenges emerge suddenly. And when the mind demands certainty, uncertainty becomes frightening. But emotional detachment reframes uncertainty. Instead of seeing it as a threat, you begin seeing it as a natural part of existence. The future has always been uncertain. Even when people believed it was predictable. And once the mind accepts this reality, anxiety begins losing its power. Because anxiety often comes from trying to control what cannot be controlled. But emotional detachment releases that pressure. You focus on what you can influence. Your actions. Your mindset. Your effort. And the rest becomes something you observe rather than fight against. But there is another subtle shift happening as well. You become less emotionally dependent on outcomes. Most people attach their emotional state to results. Success brings happiness. Failure brings frustration. Approval brings confidence. Disapproval brings insecurity. But emotional detachment creates independence from these emotional swings. You still care about outcomes. You still pursue goals. But your emotional stability does not collapse when results change. Because your identity becomes rooted in effort rather than outcome. You focus on doing your best. Learning from experience. Improving over time. And this mindset removes enormous emotional pressure. Because when success becomes the only acceptable result, every challenge feels threatening. But when growth becomes the goal, every experience becomes valuable. Even failure. Even criticism. Even difficulty. Because each experience becomes information. A signal for adjustment. A lesson for improvement. And this learning mindset transforms how you interact with life. Challenges become opportunities for reflection rather than sources of emotional defeat. But emotional detachment also strengthens patience. Patience is rare in modern culture. Everything moves quickly. Information travels instantly. Results are expected immediately. But meaningful growth rarely happens quickly. Relationships develop slowly. Skills improve gradually. Understanding deepens over time. And emotional detachment allows you to move at the pace of reality rather than the pace of expectation. You become comfortable with gradual progress. You trust long-term development. And this patience creates stability. Because impatience often creates emotional frustration. But patience creates calm persistence. And calm persistence leads to lasting results. But perhaps the most powerful transformation of emotional detachment is the development of inner authority. Inner authority means your emotional state is no longer controlled by external approval. You respect feedback. You listen to others. But your sense of worth does not collapse when someone disagrees. Because you understand that identity cannot be defined by every opinion. People will interpret your actions differently. Some will appreciate your choices. Others will criticize them. And emotional detachment allows you to accept this diversity of opinion without losing balance. Because your decisions become guided by values rather than popularity. And values create stability. When your actions align with your principles, external approval becomes less necessary. Because your internal compass provides direction. But the deeper transformation is still unfolding. Because once someone learns to remain calm during emotional situations, they begin experiencing something far more powerful. The quiet confidence that comes from knowing their peace cannot easily be disturbed. Something subtle begins happening when emotional detachment becomes stronger. You start noticing how much of human behavior is driven by emotional impulse rather than thoughtful intention. People react before they reflect. They speak before they understand. They assume before they observe. And because of this, many conflicts that appear important in the moment later reveal themselves to be unnecessary. But emotional detachment changes the pace of your mind. Instead of rushing into reaction, you begin slowing down your internal response. And that small delay becomes incredibly powerful. Because during that delay, awareness appears. You see the situation more clearly. You understand the emotional dynamics involved. And often you realize that reacting emotionally would only create more confusion. This realization is the beginning of emotional discipline. Emotional discipline does not mean suppressing emotions. It means directing them intelligently. Because emotions are powerful signals. They reveal what matters to you. They reveal your values. Your fears. Your expectations. But emotions are not always accurate interpreters of reality. They are fast. But fast does not always mean correct. Sometimes emotions exaggerate situations. Sometimes they misinterpret intentions. Sometimes they amplify problems that are actually temporary. And emotional detachment creates a healthy distance between the signal and the interpretation. You feel the emotion. But you also question it. You examine it. You ask yourself whether the emotional reaction is proportional to the situation. And this reflection often reduces the intensity of the emotion. But emotional discipline also creates another important ability. The ability to remain calm when others lose control. This ability becomes extremely valuable in relationships. Because emotional escalation is one of the most common causes of conflict. One person becomes upset. The other reacts emotionally. And the situation quickly becomes a confrontation rather than a conversation. But when one person remains emotionally grounded, the pattern changes. Calmness slows the emotional rhythm of the interaction. It invites reflection rather than reaction. And often the entire conversation becomes more constructive. But emotional detachment also protects you from something many people experience without realizing it. Emotional manipulation. Manipulation often relies on triggering strong emotional responses. Guilt. Fear. Anger. Pressure. When someone learns how to activate these emotions in others, they can influence behavior indirectly. But emotional detachment weakens this influence. Because when emotional triggers appear, you notice them. You observe them. And instead of reacting automatically, you examine the situation calmly. You ask yourself whether the emotional pressure being applied is reasonable. And this awareness restores personal autonomy. Your decisions become intentional rather than reactive. But perhaps the most interesting transformation of emotional detachment is how it changes your relationship with criticism. Criticism is one of the strongest emotional triggers for most people. Even small criticism can create defensiveness, embarrassment, anger. But emotionally detached individuals interpret criticism differently. They separate the message from the emotion. Instead of asking, "Why did they say this to me?" they ask a different question. Is there something useful inside this information? Sometimes the answer is yes. And when useful feedback appears, they learn from it. But sometimes criticism reflects someone else's frustration rather than objective truth. And emotional detachment allows you to release those comments without internalizing them. Because not every opinion deserves emotional investment. But this mindset also creates humility. Emotionally detached individuals remain open to learning. They do not assume they are always correct. They understand that growth requires feedback. But they also recognize that not all feedback carries equal value. Some opinions are thoughtful. Others are impulsive. And emotional detachment allows you to distinguish between the two. But emotional discipline also improves decision-making. Strong emotional reactions often create short-term thinking. Fear pushes people to avoid risk. Anger pushes people to retaliate quickly. Excitement pushes people toward impulsive decisions. But emotional detachment introduces balance. You still experience emotions. But they no longer dominate your thinking. Instead, emotions become one piece of information among many. And this balanced thinking leads to wiser choices. Choices that consider both immediate feelings and long-term consequences. But another important shift begins appearing as well. You become less emotionally attached to being right. Many conflicts exist because people feel the need to prove their correctness. They defend their perspective. They resist alternative viewpoints. They argue endlessly. But emotional detachment removes the emotional pressure attached to being correct. Because the goal becomes understanding rather than winning. And understanding creates collaboration rather than confrontation. When people feel safe expressing different ideas, conversations become productive rather than competitive. But emotional detachment also creates a deeper sense of independence. You become less influenced by social pressure. Less concerned with constant approval. Less reactive to trends and expectations. Because your internal stability becomes stronger than external influence. And this independence allows you to live more authentically. To make decisions based on your values rather than temporary popularity. But perhaps the most powerful result of emotional detachment is the return of mental clarity. Clarity appears when emotional noise decreases. Thoughts become organized. Attention becomes focused. And understanding deepens. Because the mind is no longer distracted by constant emotional turbulence. And once clarity becomes consistent, something remarkable happens. Life begins to feel simpler. Not because problems disappear. But because your mind no longer turns every challenge into emotional chaos. Instead, challenges become situations to navigate thoughtfully. Experiences to learn from. Moments that pass. But the most fascinating transformation of emotional detachment is still unfolding. Because once someone learns to observe emotions without being controlled by them, they begin discovering a level of inner freedom that most people rarely experience. At some point in the practice of emotional detachment, a person begins noticing a powerful shift in how they experience everyday situations. Things that once felt urgent begin to feel manageable. Things that once felt personal begin to feel neutral. And things that once created emotional storms begin to pass quietly through the mind. This change does not happen because life suddenly becomes easier. Life still presents challenges. Unexpected disagreements. Unexpected criticism. Unexpected setbacks. But the mind becomes stronger than the disturbance. And that difference changes the entire experience of living. Most emotional suffering begins with a simple habit. Taking everything personally. Someone disagrees. It feels like rejection. Someone criticizes. It feels like an attack. Someone behaves differently than expected. It feels like disrespect. But emotional detachment introduces a new understanding. Most people's behavior has very little to do with you. Their reactions often come from their own emotional state, their stress, their insecurities, their personal experiences. And once you recognize this pattern, emotional reactions begin losing their intensity. Because you stop interpreting every interaction as a reflection of your value. You begin seeing human behavior with greater psychological distance. And that distance protects your emotional balance. But this shift also creates something valuable. Freedom from constant explanation. Many people feel a deep need to explain themselves repeatedly. To justify their decisions. To defend their choices. To clarify their intentions. But emotionally detached individuals recognize something important. Not everyone needs to understand you. Some people will misunderstand regardless of how clearly you speak. Some people will interpret your actions through their own assumptions. And emotional detachment allows you to accept that reality without becoming emotionally trapped by it. Because trying to control every perception is exhausting. But releasing that control creates peace. This does not mean becoming indifferent to communication. It simply means recognizing that clarity is your responsibility. But interpretation belongs to the listener. And once you accept this distinction, the emotional burden of constant explanation disappears. But emotional detachment also improves how you experience mistakes. Mistakes are inevitable. Every person experiences them. Yet many people attach enormous emotional weight to mistakes. Embarrassment. Self-criticism. Regret. But emotionally detached individuals approach mistakes differently. They see them as information. Signals that reveal something useful. A skill that needs improvement. A decision that requires adjustment. And this learning mindset removes unnecessary emotional pain. Because mistakes stop being personal failures. They become part of growth. But emotional detachment also changes how you experience time. When the mind constantly replays past events, the present moment becomes blurred. Memories of conflict. Memories of disappointment. Memories of regret. These thoughts pull attention away from the present. But emotional detachment gently redirects attention back to now. The current moment. The current opportunity. The current experience. And this return to the present creates calmness. Because most emotional suffering exists either in the past or in imagined futures. Regret about what has already happened. Anxiety about what might happen later. But when attention rests in the present moment, emotional intensity decreases. Because the present is usually more manageable than the stories the mind creates about it. But another interesting transformation appears as well. You begin noticing how temporary emotions truly are. Anger fades. Frustration fades. Even sadness gradually softens. Yet when people react impulsively during emotional intensity, they often create consequences that last far longer than the emotion itself. A harsh word spoken in anger. A decision made in frustration. An action taken impulsively. But emotional detachment teaches patience during emotional waves. You allow the emotion to exist. But you do not rush to act within it. And often, when enough time passes, the emotion dissolves naturally. Because emotions behave like waves. They rise. They peak. And then they fade. But the mind often interrupts this natural process by continuing to feed the emotion through thought. Through replay. Through interpretation. And emotional detachment interrupts that cycle. You observe the wave without amplifying it. And eventually the mind becomes calm again. But perhaps the most powerful change emotional detachment creates is the strengthening of personal boundaries. Boundaries protect emotional well-being. They define what behavior you accept, what behavior you reject, and where your emotional energy is invested. But without emotional detachment, boundaries become difficult to maintain. Because guilt appears. Pressure appears. Fear of disappointing others appears. And people often abandon their own well-being to avoid these feelings. But emotional detachment allows you to recognize something important. Protecting your peace is not selfish. It is necessary. Because when your emotional energy becomes depleted, you cannot contribute meaningfully to your life or to others. But when your mind remains balanced, you bring clarity into every interaction, every decision, every relationship. And this clarity improves the quality of your presence. People begin trusting your calmness. They respect your steadiness. Because in a world where many react impulsively, calm individuals stand out. But this calmness is not passive. It is intentional. It comes from understanding how emotions influence perception, and how awareness can guide response. But emotional detachment continues revealing deeper layers of freedom. Because once you stop reacting emotionally to every situation, you begin discovering something far more powerful. The ability to live with genuine inner stability regardless of the chaos surrounding you. As emotional detachment continues developing, another quiet transformation begins inside the mind. You stop feeling the need to respond to everything. At first, this realization feels unusual. Because most people grow up believing that every comment deserves a reply. Every criticism deserves a defense. Every disagreement requires explanation. But emotionally detached individuals begin seeing something others often overlook. Many situations lose their power when they are not fed with reaction. Reaction is emotional fuel. Without it, many conflicts fade naturally. This does not mean ignoring important issues. It means recognizing the difference between meaningful engagement and unnecessary emotional investment. And that distinction protects your mental energy. Because mental energy is limited. Each day contains only a certain amount of attention, patience, and focus. When that energy is spent on trivial conflicts, very little remains for meaningful pursuits. But when emotional detachment becomes stronger, the mind becomes selective. You choose where your attention goes. You choose what deserves your time. And this intentional focus transforms productivity. But something even deeper begins happening as well. You become more comfortable with silence. Silence is one of the most misunderstood psychological tools. Many people feel uncomfortable with silence. They rush to fill it with explanations, defenses, justifications. But silence often carries its own quiet strength. It creates space for reflection. It prevents emotional escalation. It allows the situation to settle. And emotionally detached individuals learn to use silence intentionally. Because sometimes the most powerful response is calm observation rather than immediate reaction. But emotional detachment also reshapes how you interpret conflict. Most conflicts appear larger than they truly are because of emotional intensity. When emotions rise, perspective shrinks. People focus only on the immediate disagreement. They forget the broader context. But emotional detachment restores perspective. You begin seeing conflict as part of human interaction rather than a personal threat. Disagreement becomes information. It reveals differences in perspective. Differences in values. Differences in interpretation. And these differences are natural. Every individual experiences life through their own history, their own beliefs, their own emotional landscape. Understanding this reduces the emotional weight attached to disagreement. Because disagreement stops feeling like rejection. It becomes variation. And variation creates opportunities for understanding. But emotional detachment also strengthens emotional independence. Many people unconsciously depend on external validation for emotional stability. Praise creates happiness. Recognition creates confidence. But when validation becomes the source of emotional stability, the mind becomes vulnerable. Because validation is unpredictable. Some days it appears. Some days it does not. And when emotional well-being depends on that unpredictable source, peace becomes unstable. But emotional detachment creates internal validation. You learn to evaluate your own actions. You measure your effort, your integrity, your consistency with personal values. And when your sense of worth becomes internal rather than external, emotional independence appears. This independence creates confidence. Not the loud confidence that seeks attention, but the quiet confidence that does not require it. But another important shift begins happening. You become less emotionally attached to outcomes. Outcomes still matter. Goals still matter. But your emotional state no longer rises and falls dramatically based on results. Because you begin understanding that results are influenced by many variables. Preparation, timing, circumstances, other people's decisions. And emotional detachment allows you to focus on what you can control. Your effort, your mindset, your adaptability. This focus reduces emotional frustration. Because you are no longer fighting variables beyond your control. Instead, you concentrate on improvement. But emotional detachment also deepens your ability to observe human behavior. Without strong emotional reactions clouding perception, patterns become visible. You begin noticing how people behave when they feel insecure. How they behave when they seek attention. How they behave when they feel threatened. And this observation creates understanding. Because once behavior is understood, it becomes easier to respond with patience rather than irritation. But emotional detachment also strengthens personal boundaries. Boundaries protect your time, your energy, your mental clarity. Without boundaries, emotional exhaustion becomes inevitable. Because others may unknowingly place demands on your attention. But emotionally detached individuals recognize the importance of protecting their peace. They learn to say no when necessary. They learn to step away from unnecessary conflict. They learn to prioritize mental well-being. And this self-respect improves relationships rather than damaging them. Because clear boundaries create clarity for everyone involved. But perhaps the most powerful transformation of emotional detachment is how it changes your internal dialogue. Many people speak harshly to themselves. They replay mistakes. They criticize their own decisions. They question their worth. But emotional detachment introduces compassion toward the self. You observe your mistakes with honesty rather than judgment. You learn from them. You adjust your approach. And then you move forward. Because growth requires reflection, not self-punishment. But something even more remarkable begins appearing beneath all these changes. A deep sense of stability. Not temporary calmness. But lasting steadiness. You realize that your emotional balance no longer depends on perfect circumstances. It depends on your mindset. And once that realization becomes clear, something powerful emerges. You stop trying to control the world around you. And instead, you master the world within you. But the most fascinating stage of emotional detachment is still unfolding. Because once someone becomes emotionally stable, they begin discovering a level of inner freedom that most people spend their entire lives searching for. When emotional detachment matures, a quiet realization begins forming in the mind. You cannot control the behavior of others. You cannot control every situation. You cannot control how the world reacts to your choices. But you can control one powerful thing: your internal response. And once this understanding becomes deeply rooted, life begins to feel lighter. Because much of the emotional weight people carry comes from trying to manage things outside their influence. They try to control other people's opinions. They try to control how they are perceived. They try to control outcomes that depend on many unpredictable variables. And when those attempts fail, frustration appears. But emotional detachment removes this invisible burden. It teaches the mind to distinguish between influence and control. You can influence situations through effort, communication, and intention. But control is rarely absolute. And when the mind releases the need for total control, emotional tension dissolves. Because expectations soften. Patience increases. Adaptability grows stronger. But emotional detachment also creates something extremely valuable: psychological space. Psychological space means your thoughts are no longer crowded with constant emotional replay. You stop revisiting the same conflict again and again. You stop analyzing every comment repeatedly. You stop trying to decode every subtle behavior. And this space allows clarity to appear. Clarity is difficult when the mind is overwhelmed with emotional noise. But once the noise fades, perspective becomes sharper. You begin seeing situations with greater accuracy. You recognize patterns that were once hidden by emotional intensity. And this awareness improves decision-making. Because decisions made in emotional turbulence often lead to regret. But decisions made with calm observation tend to align with long-term values. But emotional detachment also strengthens resilience. Resilience is the ability to recover quickly after difficulty. Every life contains setbacks. Unexpected losses. Unexpected disappointments. Moments when plans fall apart. But emotional resilience allows you to face these moments without losing stability. You acknowledge the challenge. You process the emotion. But you do not become trapped inside it. Instead, you adapt. You adjust your approach. And you continue moving forward. Because emotional detachment reminds you that temporary setbacks do not define your future. They simply become part of your experience. And experience creates wisdom. But emotional detachment also transforms how you experience success. Many people attach enormous emotional pressure to success. They believe success must prove their worth. Must validate their identity. Must justify their effort. And when success becomes the source of identity, fear of failure increases. Because failure suddenly feels like personal collapse. But emotionally detached individuals approach success differently. Success becomes feedback rather than identity. It reflects effective effort. Good timing. Constructive decisions. But it does not become the foundation of self-worth. Because self-worth already exists internally. And this internal stability removes the fear attached to risk. You become willing to try new things. To explore new paths. To experiment. Because the outcome does not determine your value. But emotional detachment also deepens your connection with the present moment. When emotional reactions dominate the mind, attention constantly travels through time. Into the past. Into imagined futures. Regret pulls the mind backward. Anxiety pushes it forward. But emotional detachment gently anchors attention in the present. Because the present moment is the only place where action exists. Where change becomes possible. Where awareness becomes meaningful. And when attention returns to the present, life begins feeling richer. More detailed. More vivid. Because the mind is no longer distracted by endless emotional stories. But perhaps the most remarkable effect of emotional detachment is the emergence of inner quiet. This quiet is not emptiness. It is clarity. It is the absence of unnecessary mental noise. And inside that quiet space, insight appears. You begin understanding your own motivations more clearly. You recognize emotional patterns that once controlled your behavior. You identify beliefs that influence your reactions. And this self-awareness becomes the foundation of personal growth. Because growth begins with understanding. But emotional detachment also creates emotional maturity. Maturity means recognizing that every person is navigating their own internal struggles. Their own fears. Their own expectations. Their own uncertainties. And once you see this clearly, judgment softens. Compassion increases. You stop assuming that every negative behavior is intentional. Sometimes people react emotionally because they feel overwhelmed. Sometimes they misunderstand situations. Sometimes they simply carry unresolved experiences. And emotional detachment allows you to observe these dynamics without becoming entangled in them. But emotional maturity does not mean accepting harmful behavior. It means responding wisely rather than reacting impulsively. You protect your boundaries. You maintain your peace. But you do so calmly. Because calmness is strength. But this journey toward emotional detachment continues, revealing deeper levels of freedom. Because once someone masters their emotional responses, they begin discovering something even more powerful. The ability to live with a mind that remains steady regardless of the chaos that surrounds it. As emotional detachment deepens, a subtle but powerful transformation begins shaping the way you experience the world. You stop feeling emotionally responsible for everything around you. Many people carry an invisible burden. They feel responsible for fixing every conflict. Responsible for other people's emotions. Responsible for maintaining harmony in every situation. But this emotional responsibility often becomes overwhelming. Because no one can control the emotional state of everyone around them. Each person carries their own experiences. Their own interpretations. Their own reactions. And emotional detachment allows you to recognize this boundary. You can offer understanding. You can offer patience. But you cannot carry every emotional weight that appears in your environment. And once this boundary becomes clear, a deep sense of relief appears. Because the mind no longer feels obligated to solve every emotional disturbance it encounters. This realization restores balance. You remain compassionate without becoming emotionally exhausted. But emotional detachment also changes how you experience tension. Tension often arises from internal resistance. Something happens that the mind believes should not have happened. An unexpected criticism. A disagreement. A delay. And the mind immediately reacts with resistance. This should not be happening. But emotional detachment softens that resistance. Instead of fighting the moment emotionally, you observe it. You recognize that reality does not always align with expectation. And that recognition reduces emotional friction. Because tension often comes from trying to mentally reject what already exists. But acceptance dissolves that tension. Acceptance does not mean liking every situation. It simply means acknowledging reality without emotional struggle. And once reality is accepted, clarity appears. You can evaluate the situation calmly. You can choose your next step thoughtfully. But emotional detachment also improves your ability to recognize emotional patterns within yourself. Every person carries emotional habits. Certain situations trigger frustration. Certain comments trigger defensiveness. Certain experiences trigger insecurity. But without awareness, these patterns repeat automatically. Emotional detachment introduces observation. You begin noticing when these patterns appear. You see the trigger. You see the emotional response. And this awareness interrupts the automatic cycle. Because once a pattern becomes visible, it becomes changeable. You gain the ability to respond differently. To rewrite the emotional habit. But emotional detachment also strengthens patience with yourself. Growth is rarely perfect. Some days emotional calmness feels natural. Other days old reactions may return. But emotional detachment encourages gentle reflection rather than harsh judgment. You observe what happened. You learn from the experience. And you continue practicing awareness. Because emotional discipline grows gradually. But perhaps the most important shift during this stage is how you experience other people's opinions. Opinions lose their emotional dominance. People will always have perspectives. Some will appreciate your choices. Others may criticize them. Some may misunderstand your intentions entirely. And emotional detachment allows you to accept this diversity of perception. Because the world contains billions of viewpoints. Trying to satisfy them all is impossible. But living according to your values is possible. And emotional detachment strengthens that alignment. Your decisions become guided by principles rather than approval. You begin asking yourself different questions. Does this reflect who I want to become? Does this align with my values? Does this decision create growth? These questions create internal direction. And internal direction reduces emotional dependence on external validation. But emotional detachment also transforms how you experience stress. Stress often arises when the mind anticipates negative outcomes. It imagines worst-case scenarios. It rehearses potential problems. And this anticipation creates emotional pressure. But emotional detachment introduces balance into that process. Instead of becoming overwhelmed by imagined outcomes, you observe them calmly. You prepare where preparation is possible. And you release the rest. Because excessive anticipation rarely prevents difficulty. It simply multiplies emotional discomfort before anything has actually happened. But emotional detachment also strengthens gratitude. When emotional noise decreases, appreciation becomes easier. You notice small moments. Quiet conversations. Simple experiences. And these moments gain meaning. Because the mind is no longer distracted by endless emotional turbulence. Peace creates space for appreciation. But perhaps the deepest transformation of emotional detachment is the sense of inner stability it creates. Your emotional state becomes less dependent on perfect circumstances. It becomes rooted in awareness. Rooted in understanding. Rooted in intentional response. And once this stability appears, confidence grows naturally. Not the loud confidence that seeks attention, but the quiet confidence that emerges from emotional control. But emotional detachment continues, revealing deeper levels of psychological freedom. Because once someone understands how to protect their peace, they begin discovering something even more valuable. A mind that remains calm, clear, and resilient regardless of how unpredictable life becomes. As emotional detachment becomes natural, the mind begins experiencing life in a completely different way. Situations that once created internal storms begin passing like brief clouds. Not because the world has changed, but because your relationship with the world has changed. This is one of the most powerful psychological transformations a person can experience. Because emotional suffering is rarely created by events alone. It is created by the interpretation of those events. Two people can experience the same moment and feel entirely different emotions. One sees insult. The other sees misunderstanding. One feels rejection. The other sees difference. The situation remains identical, but interpretation shapes the emotional experience. And emotional detachment gives you control over that interpretation. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin asking deeper questions. What is actually happening here? Is my reaction helping the situation or intensifying it? Will this matter in the long run? These questions introduce reflection. And reflection changes emotional intensity. Because many emotional reactions come from incomplete understanding. But when you slow down the interpretation process, clarity increases. And clarity often reduces emotional disturbance. But emotional detachment also changes how you experience pressure. Pressure appears when expectations feel overwhelming. Deadlines. Responsibilities. Responsibilities connected to identity. Many people attach their sense of worth to performance. If they succeed, they feel valuable. If they struggle, they feel inadequate. But emotional detachment loosens this connection. Performance becomes effort. Learning. Progress. But not identity. Because identity rooted in performance becomes fragile. Circumstances change. Results fluctuate. But identity rooted in values remains stable. Integrity. Curiosity. Compassion. Persistence. These qualities remain meaningful regardless of outcome. And emotional detachment strengthens this value-centered mindset. You begin evaluating yourself by how you show up in the process rather than by the final result alone. But emotional detachment also transforms how you experience comparison. Comparison is one of the strongest emotional traps in modern life. Especially in environments filled with constant visibility. People compare achievements, appearances, recognition, progress. And comparison often creates emotional dissatisfaction. Because someone always appears to be ahead. But emotional detachment breaks this cycle. You begin recognizing that every life follows a different timeline. Different challenges. Different opportunities. Different priorities. And comparing two entirely different journeys creates unnecessary emotional tension. Instead of comparison, emotional detachment encourages personal progress. You measure growth against your past self rather than against someone else's path. And this shift creates motivation without emotional pressure. But emotional detachment also enhances self-awareness. Without constant emotional turbulence, you begin observing your internal patterns more clearly. You notice what triggers frustration. What triggers excitement? What triggers insecurity? And this awareness provides valuable insight. Because emotional reactions often reveal underlying beliefs. Beliefs about identity. Beliefs about control. Beliefs about worth. And once these beliefs become visible, they can evolve. But emotional detachment also strengthens humility. Because awareness reveals how often the mind misinterprets situations. How often assumptions replace facts. How often emotions exaggerate reality. And this realization creates intellectual openness. You become willing to reconsider perspectives. To listen more carefully. To understand before reacting. And this mindset improves relationships. Because conversations become explorations rather than competitions. But emotional detachment also strengthens courage. When emotional reactions no longer dominate decision-making, fear loses much of its power. Fear still appears. But it becomes information rather than command. You examine it. You evaluate the situation. And you move forward when the decision aligns with your values. Because courage is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to act thoughtfully despite it. But emotional detachment also changes how you experience uncertainty. Uncertainty stops feeling like danger. Instead, it becomes possibility. Life has always contained unknowns. Unexpected opportunities. Unexpected challenges. And emotional detachment allows you to navigate these unknowns calmly. Because you trust your ability to respond wisely when situations unfold. But perhaps the most profound effect of emotional detachment is the quiet confidence it creates. Confidence that does not depend on constant reassurance. Confidence that does not require approval. Confidence that grows from emotional self-control. You know that whatever situation appears, your mind will remain steady enough to navigate it. And this steadiness becomes a form of freedom. Freedom from emotional chaos. Freedom from constant reaction. Freedom from the exhausting need to control everything around you. But the journey toward emotional detachment is still revealing deeper insights. Because once someone learns to remain calm during life's unpredictable moments, they begin experiencing something truly rare. A mind that remains peaceful regardless of external noise. There is a point where emotional detachment stops feeling like a practice, and starts feeling like your natural state of mind. At first, it required effort. You had to remind yourself to pause. To observe your emotions. To avoid reacting impulsively. But slowly, something begins changing inside your mind. The pause becomes automatic. Observation becomes natural. And emotional reactions begin losing their intensity. Because your mind has learned something most people never fully realize. Not every emotional impulse deserves obedience. Emotions are signals. But signals are not instructions. They appear. They deliver information. And then they pass. But most people confuse emotional signals with emotional commands. They feel anger and believe they must express it. They feel fear and believe they must retreat. They feel insecurity and believe they must prove something. But emotional detachment breaks this automatic chain. It creates space between the signal and the action. And inside that space, wisdom appears. Because wisdom requires distance from immediate emotional pressure. But something else begins happening as this mental discipline grows stronger. Your identity becomes more stable. Many people define themselves through emotional reactions. They describe themselves as someone who gets easily frustrated. Someone who worries constantly. Someone who reacts strongly. But emotional detachment slowly dissolves these identities. Because you realize that emotions are experiences, not definitions. You are not anger. You are someone who occasionally experiences anger. You are not anxiety. You are someone who sometimes feels uncertainty. And this subtle shift changes how you relate to your own mind. You become the observer of emotion rather than the prisoner of it. But emotional detachment also strengthens another powerful ability. The ability to move forward. Many people remain emotionally trapped in past experiences. They replay conversations. They revisit mistakes. They imagine different outcomes. And this mental replay keeps emotional wounds alive. But emotional detachment introduces a healthier approach. You acknowledge the experience. You extract the lesson. And then you release the emotional attachment to it. Because the past no longer exists as an active reality. It only exists through memory. And memory does not need to dominate the present. But letting go of the past does not mean ignoring its lessons. In fact, emotional detachment allows you to learn more clearly from past experiences. Because when emotions are calm, reflection becomes more accurate. You can analyze what happened objectively. You can recognize patterns. You can adjust your approach. And this process transforms mistakes into wisdom. But emotional detachment also changes how you approach the future. Instead of imagining endless scenarios, you develop trust in your ability to adapt. Life rarely unfolds exactly as planned. Unexpected events appear. Opportunities shift. Circumstances evolve. And emotional detachment allows you to remain flexible. Because your stability no longer depends on perfect predictions. It depends on your ability to respond thoughtfully when situations change. But perhaps the most beautiful transformation of emotional detachment is the quiet confidence it creates. Confidence that does not need to prove itself. Confidence that does not compete for attention. Confidence that comes from knowing your emotional state cannot easily be controlled by external chaos. This confidence is calm. Grounded. Steady. It allows you to enter challenging situations without losing clarity. Because your peace travels with you. Not because the environment is perfect. But because your mindset remains balanced. But emotional detachment also strengthens your relationships. When you are not reacting impulsively, conversations become more thoughtful. You listen more deeply. You respond more calmly. And others begin noticing that stability. People feel safer speaking honestly around someone who does not react emotionally to every difference. And this emotional stability creates trust. Because trust grows in calm environments. But emotional detachment also protects your creativity. When the mind is constantly reacting to emotional triggers, attention becomes fragmented. Ideas struggle to form. Focus disappears. But when emotional noise fades, mental clarity returns. Thoughts become organized. Insights appear more easily. And creativity flows naturally. Because the mind finally has space to explore ideas rather than defend itself emotionally. But perhaps the most powerful gift emotional detachment offers is peace. Not temporary calmness. Not silence that disappears when something goes wrong. But deep internal peace. The kind of peace that remains present even when life becomes unpredictable. Because emotional detachment teaches something essential. Peace does not come from controlling the world. Peace comes from mastering your relationship with the world. And once this mastery begins forming, something remarkable happens. Life stops feeling like a constant emotional battlefield. Instead, it becomes a series of experiences. Moments to observe. Moments to learn. Moments to grow. And inside that perspective, emotional freedom appears. But one final realization still waits beneath the surface. Because once someone truly protects their peace, they begin understanding something that changes everything about how they move through the world. At the deepest stage of emotional detachment, a person begins understanding a truth that changes the way they experience life. Peace is not something you find. Peace is something you protect. Most people spend years searching for peace in the wrong places. They look for it in perfect circumstances, in perfect relationships, in perfect outcomes. But life rarely provides perfect conditions. Unexpected challenges appear. Misunderstandings happen. Plans change without warning. And when peace depends on everything going exactly as expected, it disappears quickly. But emotional detachment teaches a different philosophy. Peace becomes an internal responsibility. Something you guard carefully. Something you refuse to sacrifice for unnecessary emotional conflict. Because the moment you begin protecting your peace, your priorities change. You become more selective about what deserves your emotional energy. Not every disagreement deserves your attention. Not every criticism deserves your defense. Not every misunderstanding deserves your explanation. And this selectivity creates freedom. Because emotional energy that was once scattered across dozens of small conflicts becomes concentrated. Focused on meaningful goals. Focused on relationships that bring value. Focused on personal growth. But protecting your peace also means becoming comfortable with something many people struggle to accept. Not everyone will understand you. Some people will misunderstand your silence. Some people will misinterpret your calmness. Some people will project their own expectations onto your choices. And emotional detachment allows you to accept that reality without feeling the need to correct every perception. Because trying to control how every person sees you is exhausting. But living according to your values is liberating. Your clarity becomes more important than universal approval. Your stability becomes more important than temporary validation. And once this mindset develops, your emotional state becomes much harder to disturb. But protecting your peace also requires strong boundaries. Boundaries are not walls that isolate you from others. They are guidelines that protect your emotional well-being. They define what behavior you accept. They define what behavior you decline. And emotional detachment makes these boundaries easier to maintain. Because guilt and pressure lose much of their influence. You understand that saying no to unnecessary stress is not selfish. It is responsible. Because protecting your mental clarity allows you to contribute more meaningfully to the areas of life that truly matter. But emotional detachment also reveals something profound about human interaction. Many emotional conflicts are temporary storms. They appear suddenly. They create tension. And then they fade with time. But when people react impulsively during these storms, they create consequences that last far longer than the storm itself. Harsh words. Impulsive decisions. Broken trust. But emotional detachment allows you to wait. To observe. To allow emotional intensity to settle before acting. And often, once the storm passes, the situation becomes far easier to understand. Because clarity returns when emotional intensity fades. But protecting your peace also means accepting uncertainty. The future will always contain unknowns. Unexpected opportunities. unexpected challenges. And emotional detachment removes the pressure to predict everything perfectly. Instead, it builds confidence in your ability to respond wisely when life unfolds. You trust your awareness, your adaptability, your ability to learn from experience. And this trust creates emotional stability. Because stability does not come from predicting every outcome. It comes from knowing you can navigate whatever appears. But perhaps the most powerful change emotional detachment creates is how you experience everyday life. Small moments become meaningful. Quiet conversations. Simple routines. Moments of reflection. Because the mind is no longer overwhelmed by emotional turbulence. You begin noticing details that once passed unnoticed. And these details bring quiet appreciation. But emotional detachment also deepens your understanding of yourself. You become aware of your patterns, your triggers, your emotional habits. And this awareness gives you the power to evolve. Because growth begins with recognition. But emotional detachment also introduces humility. You realize how often the mind once reacted without understanding. How often assumptions replaced facts. How often emotional interpretations distorted reality. And this realization encourages patience with others. Because everyone is navigating their own internal world. Their own fears. Their own expectations. Their own experiences. And emotional detachment allows you to observe these complexities without becoming overwhelmed by them. But the final gift of emotional detachment is something most people search for without realizing it. Freedom. Freedom from constant emotional reaction. Freedom from the exhausting need for approval. Freedom from the pressure to control every outcome. A freedom that allows you to move through life calmly. To respond thoughtfully. To remain grounded even when the world becomes chaotic. But one final insight remains. Because once someone truly learns to protect their peace, they begin realizing that emotional detachment is not about avoiding life. It is about experiencing life with a clear, steady, and unshakable mind. When emotional detachment finally becomes part of your natural mindset, life begins revealing a very different rhythm. Not the chaotic rhythm driven by constant reaction. Not the exhausting rhythm driven by emotional turbulence. But a quieter rhythm. A rhythm guided by awareness. Because once you stop reacting to everything, something unexpected happens. You start seeing life more clearly. Many situations that once felt overwhelming begin appearing simpler than you imagined. Conflicts lose their dramatic intensity. Criticism loses its emotional sting. Uncertainty loses its frightening edge. And the reason is simple. Your mind is no longer amplifying every experience through emotional reaction. Instead, it is observing calmly. Understanding patiently. Responding intentionally. And this shift changes everything about how you move through the world. You stop feeling the need to prove yourself constantly. You stop chasing approval. You stop defending every opinion. Because emotional detachment teaches something powerful. Your peace is more valuable than winning arguments. Your clarity is more valuable than constant validation. And your energy is too valuable to spend on emotional chaos. But this does not make you distant from life. In fact, it allows you to engage more deeply. Because when the mind is calm, presence becomes stronger. You listen more carefully. You observe more clearly. You respond more thoughtfully. And people feel that difference. Calm individuals often influence environments without trying to. Because calmness is contagious. Just as emotional chaos spreads through reaction, emotional stability spreads through presence. When one person remains grounded, others often begin slowing down as well. And this quiet influence is powerful. But emotional detachment also creates a stronger relationship with yourself. You begin trusting your own judgment more. Because decisions are no longer driven by emotional impulse. They come from reflection. From understanding. From values that remain steady even when circumstances change. And this trust creates independence. Not isolation. But independence of thought. You become comfortable making choices that align with your values even when others disagree. Because emotional detachment removes the fear of disapproval. But something even deeper appears beneath this independence. Self-respect. When you protect your peace consistently, you demonstrate respect for your own mental well-being. You stop allowing unnecessary emotional disturbances to dominate your attention. You stop allowing every opinion to shape your identity. And this quiet self-respect strengthens confidence. Not the loud confidence that seeks recognition. But the quiet confidence that simply exists. The kind of confidence that does not need constant reassurance. Because it is built on emotional discipline. But emotional detachment also strengthens resilience. Life will still present challenges. Unexpected setbacks. Moments of uncertainty. But these moments no longer feel like emotional collapse. They become experiences to navigate. Situations to understand. Lessons to absorb. Because emotional detachment reminds you that emotional storms always pass. No feeling lasts forever. Anger fades. Frustration fades. Even sadness gradually softens. And when you stop reacting impulsively during those storms, you avoid creating consequences that last longer than the emotion itself. But perhaps the most beautiful transformation emotional detachment creates is the return of mental quiet. A quiet mind is rare in a world filled with constant stimulation. Notifications. Opinions. Endless information. But emotional detachment protects that quiet space. It allows the mind to rest. To reflect. To think clearly. And inside that quiet space, wisdom appears. You begin understanding life differently. You recognize patterns in human behavior. You understand your own emotional tendencies. And this awareness allows you to navigate life with greater clarity. But emotional detachment also reveals something profound about happiness. Happiness does not come from eliminating every problem. It comes from maintaining internal stability even when problems appear. Because life will always contain challenges. But challenges do not have to destroy your peace. And once this becomes clear, a powerful freedom appears. Freedom from constant emotional reaction. Freedom from unnecessary mental noise. Freedom from the exhausting need to control everything around you. Instead, you move through life with calm awareness. You experience emotions without being controlled by them. You listen without becoming defensive. You observe without rushing to judgment. And this mindset creates a rare kind of strength. Not aggressive strength. Not dramatic strength. But steady, quiet strength. The kind that remains balanced regardless of what happens around it. And perhaps that is the deepest meaning of emotional detachment. Not indifference. Not distance. But mastery. The mastery of your inner world. Because once your mind becomes calm, aware, and disciplined, very little in the outside world has the power to disturb your peace again.